Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal study scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now, as always, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is a fantastic group that does a lot of work to promote animal studies in Australia, in New Zealand, and all around the world. I strongly recommend that you get over to the ASA Facebook page and like it, because ASA posts a lot of very relevant and interesting items for animal studies scholars. And I also encourage you to become a member. Membership subs helps the organisation do its wonderful work for animal studies scholars. Right, now, very exciting, this episode of Knowing Animals is coming to you from Mexico City, where I'm attending the Minding Animals Conference. It's an absolutely fantastic conference, massive, and it gives me the opportunity to speak to people who I would otherwise be very unlikely to see or see very irregularly. Now, I'm starting off really big with one of the really big names here at the conference. I'm very, very lucky to be joined by Carol J. Adams. Now, Carol is going to be very known to a lot of listeners for her book, The Sexual Politics of Meat. And today we're going to discuss her new book, which is called Burger. It's published by Bloomsbury Publishing and it came out this year, 2018. Welcome to the podcast, Carol.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be a part of this, and thanks for all your energy and organizing of this podcast so that people can learn more about the knowing of the animals we can be doing.
My very great pleasure. So, Carol, can you start by telling us what inspired this book?
Well, Bloomsbury does a series called Object Lessons. It could be about computer, driver's license, drones, container boxes, telephone booths, whale song, tumor. And I was visiting the Bloomsbury offices in London and just brainstorming with them, and I thought, now, would that not be fun to do the object burger and sort of point my attention for a little while at the history of the hamburger and what is going to overthrow it, which could be the veggie burger or the new plant-based meats, and just have fun looking at this object burger.
Yeah, wonderful. So I've been lucky enough to have a look through the book already, even though it's hot off the press. So in it you write, the burger as both idea and food item is tightly coiled with the experience of being a citizen of the United States. Why is the burger so iconic and so entwined with American identity?
I think there are several reasons for that. The first reason is that I think it ties in with this notion of freedom, that the United States was offering religious freedom and all, but that one of the things that happened with the United States was by the appropriation of native land. It was felt that here was this continent for the taking. And one of the things that happened was there was enough space for people to have as many animals as they wanted. And through a variety of technologies that emerged at the end of the 19th century, refrigeration on trains, even barbed wire, a sped-up slaughterhouse, hamburger meat became available, this ground-up meat, and very creative people started making hamburgers in places that were iconically American. County fairs, for instance, or agricultural fairs. And so even though it's ostensibly from Hamburg, Germany, it got right from the start, its birth was traced to the U.S. And so I think part of that is that it's a democratic product. It's inexpensive. Anyone can eat it. And so it's seen to represent all that aspiration of the U.S., of both land and a taste.
So what does the hamburger tell us about Americans and their relationship with animals?
Well, at this point, I think the hamburger is telling us a lot about anybody's relationship to animals, because what was iconically the U.S.-based meal has spread throughout the world now. And what it tells us is this is how far distanced you can be. I think this is the furthest distance you can go from the animal, is this minced up meat, ostensibly from the shoulder of an animal, but really it can be from other body parts too, put into a patty, made into a patty, and then slipped onto a bun. It's seen as something that is fast food or something that could be gourmet, so anybody can put their imprint on it as well. They can grab it at one of the fast food chains, or they can make their own, or they can go to a really fancy restaurant and have a $50 burger. It just comes with all of the accoutrements of taste bud pleasure, because it has at least 20% of it is fat, and our bodies respond to fat in a positive way.
So I'm detecting then a lot of themes. From an Australian perspective, we most certainly have embraced the hamburger. And it's almost a kind of a part of the kind of neo-colonial project, or the cultural reimagining of the world influenced by America. I mean, a lot of it would have come from Hollywood and images of seeing Americans eating hamburgers and that kind of thing. So there's that theme. But you're also very famous for writing on gender politics and gender issues. Is there a gendered aspect to the hamburger?
Yes, and I think that the gendered aspect has three parts to it, or at least three. The first is it was women who did not want to buy the hamburger in the early 1900s. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle had come out. This idea of the hamburger holding all the putrid parts of the body that had been rejected was very strong. So one of the first innovators in hamburgers was White Castle. And the person who moved White Castle into sort of being a franchise, which is this big development for the hamburger from being solo operators to a franchise, he decided that they needed a specific outreach to women. And they created a Betty Crocker-like persona for a woman who went around to introduce hamburgers to middle-class women in cities, in women's clubs, and then had them come back to White Castle to see how clean the kitchen was. And their advertising included, give mother a night off. So hamburgers were seen as something helping women. The second thing is that the hamburger is very deeply tied to sort of sexualized bodies now by fast food. So what fast food did in the 30s of trying to attract women, now fast food, especially in the 90s and early 21st century, was trying to reach that very attractive market of 16 to 24-year-old males. And so suddenly they started to sexualize the burger. I mean, it had always had a certain degree of sexualizing, but they sexualized it in a new way, showing women eating really big burgers, so that there were all these fantasies of what else they could fit in their mouths. And just the burger is often bigger than the woman in an ad, so it's floating above her. It's really got the control over her. So there was this notion of this woman is eating the burger for you. The third area is thinking of women as meat, putting women as a hamburger in pornography or on Super Bowl ads, really pushing the notion that women are objects to be consumed.
And hamburgers are also associated with the working class and the common person. Can you say something about that link between being an everyday person and eating a hamburger?
I was looking at the notion of what I call the citizen burger, which is a pun on burger, German for citizen, but that the hamburger was the citizen's food. Anybody could eat it. So lots of politicians are shown eating out at a hamburger place. It's a way of sort of normalizing them, not showing that they're the average Joe. They're eating the average Joe's food. And what I want to do with that, or what I do, is sort of twist that to show an example of, say, Bill Clinton, the president in the 1990s. He was known for eating hamburgers, or the papers celebrated that. But once he got into the White House, he started eating Boca burgers, which were an early form of sort of fast food veggie burger that was very tasty. So I was trying to begin to create the notion of slippage, that the burger is actually a modernist project, and perhaps it's going to slip out of the bun.
Can you imagine a world where we're eating burgers but animals aren't being harmed in the production of those burgers?
Yes, because the animals aren't being used in the production of the burgers. One of the things I do is I go and visit two places that were making plant-based meat, as they call it, Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods. Impossible Foods makes a burger that bleeds with all the resources of the Silicon Valley. They researched and decided that what gives hamburger its special taste and flavor is blood. So they created a vegetable blood. What kind of vegetable blood they wanted to use, because vegetables bleed too. It's a heme that they've come up with. And so the burger, while it's cooking, releases this blood and turns color and becomes a burger that tastes very similar to the hamburger. The Beyond Meat created the Beyond Burger. And one of the things they decided was that one of the things that happens with a hamburger is called the Maillard effect. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. I've not heard it pronounced. But the Maillard effect happens in the hamburger because it's releasing fat and not in a predictable way because of the sinews and all the muscle parts of the meat. They get released in uneven ways, but in doing that, create a sort of caramelization. And so they created that process by using coconut oil, which when it's cold becomes a solid, and then when it's hot, it's released. And so they tackled it that way. Both of those products were not made for vegans or vegetarians. They're made for meat eaters who say, oh, I could never give up my hamburger. And what they're trying to do is help stop the climate change that's associated with eating cows.
And can you imagine a time where meat eaters, particularly men who have some kind of machismo notion mixed in with their meat consumption, accepting plant-based meats?
Well, they do now when they go see their doctor and find out, they need a quadruple bypass or they've got high cholesterol, and the first thing they're told, I guess President Trump has just recently been told that he needs to change his diet. And we know that one of his favorite foods is McDonald's. So very masculine, uptight about identity, virility, meat eaters are changing when their doctors order it. I would like to see a more cultural change where we're not valorizing that kind of masculinity and virility to begin with. And we eliminate this notion that meat is something anybody needs to eat.
Fascinating. Well, Carol, I ask everybody who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Can I say one more thing about the burger?
Please.
One of the things I was trying to do in this book was also have a little fun, to take something that's this iconic and look at it. I look at movies. For instance, Harold and Kumar go to White Castle, and what people don't realize is that Kumar is eating a veggie burger. because the actor was vegetarian. I look at the history of the veggie burger because what I argue is the innovation of the hamburger was that it was a single portion protein patty. And where else are those in food cultures around the globe? And I locate the earliest ones in India, South India, BCE. And the falafel is another example. Flatten it and it's a burger. So I'm trying to put the hamburger within a larger cultural context. I also want to put it in that colonialist context of grabbing land and killing off buffalo. All of these terrible things that are part of United States history contributed to the growth of popularity of the hamburger, and it's sort of invisible. And I also wanted to look at what happens to the cow, because the hamburger is a cow burger, and yet we don't hear hamburger-eating hamburger historians ever talking about that aspect. What's the slaughter involved? What happens to the cow? And finally, I look at sort of modernist identity crises of the burger, both environmental and health.
Wonderful. So it's a fascinating read, and as you say, it includes images and it's beautifully presented. It's not kind of an overwhelming book. It's a beautiful book, and one that is accessible, I think, to a wide audience.
Thank you.
So I highly recommend it. So 5 quick questions, Carol.
Okay.
Are you ready to go? Okay. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Okay, can I say something? I don't mean in any way to... I wrote my first piece of pro-animal scholarship
wonderful.
in 1974.
Right.
Before Animal Liberation was out. And during writing it, I read Anna Kingsford, a 19th century vegetarian writer, theosophist. I read Agnes Ryan, who's in The Sexual Politics of Meat. I read her manuscripts. I read novels that seemed to problematize how we look at animals, like Surfacing by Margaret Atwood, one of her earliest novels. There wasn't anything called pro-animal scholarship. There was material. I mean, eventually I read Bridget Brophy's 1965 op-ed on animal rights that was in the Times Literary Supplement. All of that swirled around at that point and were great gifts to me.
Wonderful. Well, you've partially answered the second question is, can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote? So it sounds like it was that piece.
So I wrote something called the Edible Complex, not Oedipal, but Edible Complex. When I was in divinity school, I wrote it for a course on feminist ethics for Mary Daly. It then appeared in the Lesbian Reader in 1975, and out of that grew The Sexual Politics of Meat.
Oh, wonderful. Fascinating. So, Carol, if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Josephine Donovan. I've co-edited 3 books with her. She has pioneered working on the feminist care ethics, as have other women, Marty Keel, the late Marty Keel. But because I've also worked with her, she's edited me, I've learned from her through friendship and through professional work and through her visionary approach to always returning us to the case that if we pay attention to animals, they're telling us they don't want to be eaten.
Wonderful. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Well, to begin with, they could stop eating them, stop eating dairy products, and help other people learn about veganism. I think that we don't make enough out of our own personal choices and how those can have a ripple effect. I also think citing others, creating what Minding Animals does, which is to bring this conversation. I know that many courses where issues around factory farming and issues about ecofeminism are discussed, students are empowered to think for themselves. And I think that's always a great gift.
Great. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Well, if we stopped using them for food, I believe we would eliminate 95% of animal oppression.
Right. So that would be it.
Yes.
Yeah. Wonderful. So, Carol, do you know what you're working on next?
I'm working on a couple things. I'm working on a book that's trying to show how veganism and animal activism are part of the resistance, are part of challenging regressive politics. So I'm looking at misogyny, climate change, compassion, food justice, and how we got here, regressive times, to try to help progressive people who haven't yet gotten it about animals to think a little more concretely and creatively. Because often the response is, well, why do you care about animals when there's so much human suffering? Or that veganism is a personal choice. So with a co-author, Ginny Messina, who's written several books, we've written several books together, we're placing this truly within the progressive movement and helping understand how animality functions in social oppression and why during this time of great anguish about the state, especially of the United States, when we may have a tendency to be depressed or stressed, a vegan diet could actually be helpful at that level as well.
So, Carol, how do people find out more about your work?
I have a website, caroljadams.com. Be sure to use the J. And there are several interviews there under the CJA section, which is the personal section. There's also a blog. But the interviews, I think, provide people with ways of sort of interacting through the interviewer, like you, how to approach some of my ideas. And there's also a few videos that show examples of what I've called the sexual politics of meat. They can also read my books.
Fantastic. Well, Carol, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or to like us at Facebook at Knowing Animals. Also, please leave a review at iTunes. Reviews matter a great deal. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.